James Bond is one of the most iconic movie roles of all time. We've seen 6 different actors pick up the mantle in live action across 25 films, and there is a lot of buzz around who the next actor to don the iconic tuxedo will be. But today I want to take a look at one of the most overlooked and complicated James Bond portrayals, and this just so happens to be what Timothy Dalton did with the character. Outside of George Lazenby, Dalton had the shortest stint as the smooth-talking special agent, and neither of his movies are really considered classic Bond films. They're both typically pretty middle of the pack in most people's Bond movie rankings. And since I've rarely heard him being in the conversation as the best James Bond, I wanted to revisit The Living Daylights and License to Kill so I could really analyze and examine just how good Timothy Dalton was as this legendary character. Perhaps the biggest thing that stood out to me about the Dalton films is that he's playing a much darker and grittier version of James Bond, especially when compared to Roger Moore, who was his predecessor. Roger Moore just had a lighter and more comedic presence as 007. I mean, one of his movies is literally called Octopussy. And since Roger Moore played the character in 7 films, tied with Sean Connery for the most outings as the character, you'd think this more grounded version of the character might be a welcome change. But this just wasn't what fans of the franchise had grown accustomed to, leading to mixed reviews and fan sentiment on Dalton as this iconic special agent. And after re-watching these 2 movies, I think I understand why. In theory, a more psychologically driven portrayal of James Bond could work, but at the end of the day, these are still action films from the late 1980s, so there's certainly a limitation on what they could do at the time just technologically. And also, there's just always going to be a fantastical element to a James Bond film that is inescapable. He's got all the crazy gadgets, and there's always a few over-the-top action set pieces. These things are the bloodline of the James Bond franchise, but that also makes it very difficult to balance a more grounded iteration of the character with these fantastical and admittedly a bit goofy narrative elements. Like, for example, in The Living Daylights, we literally see Mr. Bond cutting a car in half with a laser beam and dangling out of the back of a plane via a cargo net. These are just things that don't lend themselves to taking the movie super seriously. It sort of mandates us to turn on our suspension of disbelief, which is totally fine. But to then portray Bond as this grounded, gritty detective in the quieter moments of the film just clashes a bit tonally. Putting this issue to the side, I will say that I do have a great deal of respect for Dalton's take on James Bond. Partially because I think it laid the groundwork for Daniel Craig's most recent iteration of the character. While you certainly can agree or disagree on whether or not Craig is the best James Bond, I do think he's undoubtedly in 2 of the best Bond films. Casino Royale and Skyfall are both phenomenal movies, and these sort of more grounded and psychologically driven narratives certainly build off of Dalton's portrayal. Timothy Dalton's Bond wasn't super slick, didn't have quippy humor, and isn't even all that charming really, but that's precisely what made him perhaps the most dangerous James Bond ever put to screen. He wasn't trying to flirt with every female with a pulse, or trying to sell watches. He was a man on a mission, and he took his objectives very seriously. We especially see this in License to Kill, where he just goes rogue in search of revenge. Sanchez murdered his friend's wife and left his friend viciously maimed by a shark, so he wants to kill Sanchez and put a stop to his operation. And he will do whatever it takes to achieve this goal, thus creating perhaps the most focused and goal-oriented James Bond of all time. The moment that particularly stands out to me is when Dalton's Bond catches the man who was paid off by Sanchez. The way Timothy Dalton just dumps all the money into the shark tank and tells him, "You keep it," as he then proceeds to watch a shark literally eat this man alive, is absolutely bone-chilling. And this intensity is certainly the strongest aspect of Timothy Dalton's portrayal. While I have previously noted the tonal clash issue that's at play with the Timothy Dalton films, I will say that in some ways his Bond works better than his predecessors. I particularly like that he isn't a celebrity. He's just a spy and isn't instantly recognized by others when he steps into a room. Sean Connery and Roger Moore playing a well-known, famous James Bond was fun and added interesting elements into their films, but Dalton's version is certainly more realistic. I mean, the whole point of being a spy is being able to operate in the shadows. That kind of becomes an impossibility if you're a borderline celebrity. The more personal story that we get throughout License to Kill also helps to make Dalton's Bond feel the most human. He has no problem questioning his orders or even going rogue when his moral ambitions differ from what his organization wants him to do. In this sense, he just feels more like a true human being and more of an official spy than the other iterations we've gotten of 007. I guess my overall feelings on Timothy Dalton's Bond are a little complicated. I see the vision, and I think he and his movies execute on some of it. I can also acknowledge that he's probably the most accurate James Bond if we're basing things off of Fleming's books. However, when I think of James Bond, and when most people think of James Bond, frankly, they first think of the gadgets, the suave personality, the perfectly fitted tuxedos, and the awesome action set pieces. It's a flashy role inherently based on the plethora of Bond movies we've gotten, and I do think Timothy Dalton sticks out like a sore thumb for being so different. Now, this doesn't mean that I think Dalton is the worst James Bond, because I certainly don't. I would place him above George Lazenby and Roger Moore, maybe even Pierce Brosnan. But the reason that he can't quite get into my conversation for being the best Bond of all time is because of the very things that make him stand out so much. He simply plays the James Bond that feels the least like James Bond. And it's a really weird paradox, but I'd say that Dalton is most likely to either be your least favorite or one of your favorites. Because he's such an atypical James Bond, I think it really comes down to how much you like the standard Bond formula, how attached you are to the classic Bond portrayal, if you will. And for me personally, I'd say I'm somewhere in the middle, where I think the fun over-the-top nature of the character is the lifeline of the franchise, but at the same time it gets a little repetitive and makes binge-watching the franchise kind of rough sometimes. All in all, I'd give Timothy Dalton a C+, B- for his outings as this iconic character. This might be a weird comparison, but I kind of think of him similarly to Val Kilmer as Batman. Kilmer is certainly not the best Batman, certainly not the worst Batman, was a more psychologically driven iteration of the character in a film whose plot doesn't really mesh well with that more grounded take, and thus Val Kilmer, much like Timothy Dalton, ends up somewhere in the middle of the pack for me. Well, if you made it this far, I'd love to hear your thoughts on Timothy Dalton as James Bond. Where would you rank him amongst the pantheon of actors to play Agent 007? I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please feel free to drop a like and subscribe for more Screen Stories content. Thank you for watching, and until next time, peace.